The cold January morning of 2026 found Marcus staring at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows of his downtown office, the city sprawling beneath him like a chessboard waiting for his next move. 6 months ago, he had been just another middle manager, competent but unremarkable, watching opportunities slip through his fingers while others ascended the corporate hierarchy with seemingly effortless grace. Today, he embodied something entirely different, a calculated precision that had transformed not just his career, but his entire existence. The transformation hadn't begun with grand proclamations or dramatic moments of revelation. It started with a simple recognition that had crystallized during a particularly brutal quarterly review. In a world where resources are finite and competition is infinite, only those who master the art of strategic manipulation truly thrive. This wasn't about becoming cruel or unethical, it was about understanding power dynamics, human psychology, and the delicate dance of influence that governs every meaningful interaction. Marcus had spent the previous year studying the works of Niccolò Machiavelli, not as historical curiosity, but as practical blueprint. It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both, the Renaissance philosopher had written, and Marcus began to understand that this wasn't advocacy for tyranny, but recognition of a fundamental truth about human nature. People respond more consistently to respect earned through competence and controlled authority than to the fleeting warmth of personal affection. The first principle he internalized was the concept of calculated authenticity. Traditional self-help advised being yourself, but Marcus learned that the self is not a fixed entity, it's a strategic construction that can be refined, optimized, and deployed with surgical precision. This didn't mean becoming fake or manipulative in the shallow sense. Instead, it meant developing multiple authentic versions of himself, each calibrated for specific situations and objectives. In board meetings, he cultivated a presence that commanded attention through measured silence and precisely timed interventions. He learned to speak only when his words would carry maximum impact, understanding that in high-stakes environments, frequent contributions dilute authority while strategic restraint amplifies it. His colleagues began to lean forward when he cleared his throat, knowing that whatever followed would be worth hearing. With subordinates, he balanced accessibility with professional distance, creating an atmosphere where people felt heard without becoming overly familiar. He discovered that employees performed better when they respected rather than loved their supervisor, because respect creates clarity of expectations while affection breeds presumption and complacency. In social situations, he developed the ability to read micro-expressions, vocal tonalities, and body language with the precision of a behavioral analyst. This wasn't about manipulation in the predatory sense, but about understanding what people truly wanted versus what they claimed to want, and positioning himself as the solution to their authentic needs rather than their stated preferences. The second transformation involved reframing his relationship with failure and setbacks. Previously, Marcus had experienced disappointments as personal shortcomings that reflected his inadequacy. The Machiavellian mindset taught him to view obstacles as data points in a larger strategic equation. Every rejection, every missed opportunity, every moment of embarrassment became intelligence that informed future decisions. When his proposal for departmental restructuring was initially dismissed by senior leadership, his former self would have retreated into self-doubt and resentment. Instead, he spent 3 weeks analyzing exactly why the proposal failed, identifying the political considerations he had overlooked, the stakeholders he hadn't properly consulted, and the timing factors that worked against him. 6 months later, he reintroduced virtually the same proposal with minor modifications that addressed these variables, and watched it receive unanimous approval. This shift from emotional reaction to analytical assessment became the foundation of his mental resilience. Disappointments stopped feeling like verdicts on his worth and started serving as tuition for increasingly sophisticated strategic thinking. He began to actively seek situations where failure was possible, understanding that the intelligence gained from calculated risks far outweighed the temporary discomfort of occasional setbacks. The third element of his transformation centered on information asymmetry and strategic patience. Marcus realized that in most professional and personal situations, whoever possessed superior information held decisive advantage. He began cultivating relationships not for their immediate social value, but for their intelligence potential. Lunch conversations with colleagues from other departments became reconnaissance missions. Industry conferences transformed into data-gathering operations. Even casual social interactions were approached with an awareness of what insights might emerge. More importantly, he learned to guard his own information with the discipline of a career diplomat. He stopped sharing his plans, his concerns, or his aspirations with anyone who didn't need to know. This created an aura of mystery that enhanced his perceived competence while protecting him from those who might use his vulnerabilities against him. People began projecting their own assumptions about his capabilities onto him, and he discovered that being underestimated or overestimated both provided strategic advantages depending on the situation. Strategic patience became perhaps his most powerful weapon. In a culture obsessed with immediate gratification and instant results, Marcus learned to think in longer time horizons. He would plant seeds of influence that might not bloom for months or years, understanding that sustainable power comes from compound effects rather than dramatic gestures. When colleagues rushed to claim credit for short-term victories, he focused on positioning himself for long-term dominance. This patience extended to his personal development as well. Instead of seeking immediate recognition for his evolving capabilities, he allowed his transformation to speak through results rather than announcements. He stopped telling people about the books he was reading, the skills he was developing, or the strategies he was implementing. Instead, he let his increasingly effective performance create curiosity about his methods. The psychological dimension of his transformation proved equally crucial. Marcus began to understand that most people operate from emotional impulses disguised as rational decisions. Fear, insecurity, ego, and desire drive human behavior far more than logic or principle. This insight allowed him to predict responses and engineer outcomes with remarkable accuracy. He learned to identify each person's primary psychological drivers, the security-seeking individuals who responded to stability and predictability, the status-oriented personalities motivated by recognition and hierarchy, the connection-focused people who valued belonging and acceptance. This wasn't about manipulation in a cynical sense, but about communication in the most effective possible format for each individual's psychological architecture. With security-oriented colleagues, he framed proposals in terms of risk mitigation and stability preservation. For status-conscious individuals, he emphasized opportunities for recognition and advancement. When dealing with relationship-focused people, he highlighted collaboration and team benefits. This approach dramatically increased his persuasive effectiveness while simultaneously providing genuine value to each person according to their authentic priorities. The transformation also required developing emotional discipline that bordered on the superhuman. Marcus trained himself to maintain composure under pressure, to respond rather than react, and to separate his emotional experience from his strategic decision-making. This didn't mean becoming emotionally numb or disconnected. Instead, he learned to experience emotions fully while preventing them from driving his behavior. When facing criticism, he taught himself to extract useful information while discarding the emotional charge. When experiencing success, he celebrated privately while maintaining professional equanimity publicly. When dealing with difficult personalities, he developed the ability to remain focused on objectives rather than getting drawn into psychological drama. This emotional discipline created a compound effect that enhanced every other aspect of his development. Clear thinking led to better decisions. Better decisions created superior results. Superior results built reputation and influence. Reputation and influence opened doors to bigger opportunities. The cycle reinforced itself, creating momentum that became increasingly difficult for others to match. By the end of his first year of conscious transformation, Marcus had been promoted twice, had developed a network of strategic relationships throughout his industry, and had established himself as a go-to problem solver for complex challenges. More importantly, he had discovered that the Machiavellian approach, properly understood, wasn't about becoming ruthless or unethical. It was about becoming strategically sophisticated in a world where naivety masquerades as virtue while accomplishing nothing meaningful. The old Marcus had been well-intentioned but ineffective, kind but ignored, honest but overlooked. The transformed Marcus remained fundamentally ethical, but had learned to package his ethics in formats that actually influenced outcomes rather than simply making him feel morally superior. He had discovered that good intentions without strategic competence often produce worse results than calculated approaches guided by principled objectives. As he stood in his office that January morning, watching the sun rise over a city full of people still operating from emotional impulses and wishful thinking, Marcus felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with arrogance or superiority. He had simply learned to play the game of life with greater skill, creating better outcomes for himself and, increasingly, for those around him who benefited from his more effective leadership and influence. The transformation was far from complete. He understood that developing Machiavellian sophistication was a lifelong process of refinement and adaptation. But he had established the foundation, the psychological frameworks, the strategic thinking patterns, and the emotional discipline that would continue to compound over time. The second part of his journey would involve deepening these capabilities and extending them into every aspect of his existence. Part 2, The Master of Self. The conference room fell silent as Marcus finished outlining his division's performance metrics for the quarter. Every number exceeded projections. Every initiative had not only met its objectives but had created additional value streams that nobody had anticipated. As his colleagues absorbed the implications of what they were seeing, Marcus recognized a familiar pattern emerging, the moment when competence crosses the threshold into something approaching inevitability. 6 months into his transformation, he had learned that raw intelligence and strategic thinking, while necessary, were insufficient for sustained dominance. The second phase of his development focused on something far more challenging than external manipulation: the complete mastery of his internal landscape. This meant developing levels of self-control, focus, and systematic thinking that most people would consider excessive or unnecessary. The journey began with a brutal audit of his current capabilities. Marcus spent 2 weeks tracking every decision he made, every impulse he followed or resisted, every moment when his attention wandered from his stated priorities. The results were simultaneously humbling and illuminating. He discovered that despite his strategic successes, he remained fundamentally reactive rather than proactive, allowing external circumstances and other people's agendas to dictate his daily experience. His mornings, which should have been his most productive hours, were consistently hijacked by email responses and minor emergencies that felt urgent but contributed nothing to his long-term objectives. His evenings, intended for strategic planning and skill development, frequently dissolved into passive entertainment and social obligations that provided temporary pleasure but no lasting value. Most concerning, he realized that his emotional state remained largely dependent on external validation and immediate circumstances rather than being grounded in deeper principles and longer-term vision. The first element of internal mastery involved redesigning his relationship with time. Marcus had read about time management techniques throughout his career, but had never understood that time management is actually attention management, and attention management is ultimately consciousness management. He began to view each day not as a series of events happening to him, but as a canvas he could paint with conscious intention. He implemented what he privately called temporal sovereignty, the absolute refusal to allow other people's poor planning or emotional urgency to dictate his priorities. This required developing the psychological strength to disappoint others in service of longer-term effectiveness. When colleagues requested immediate meetings for non-critical issues, he began suggesting alternative timeframes that better aligned with his strategic schedule. When social invitations conflicted with his development activities, he declined without elaborate explanations or apologies. This wasn't about becoming antisocial or unresponsive to legitimate needs. Instead, it was about establishing clear boundaries that protected his most valuable resource, focused attention on high-impact activities. The result was paradoxical but predictable. By becoming less available for trivial requests, he became more valuable for important ones. People began bringing him only their most significant challenges, treating his time as the scarce and valuable resource it actually was. The second aspect of internal mastery centered on what Marcus termed cognitive architecture, the systematic development of thinking patterns that produced consistently superior results. He realized that most people, including his former self, approached problems reactively, applying whatever analytical frameworks came most naturally or felt most comfortable in the moment. This approach worked adequately for routine challenges but broke down completely when facing complex or novel situations. Marcus began studying how truly exceptional performers in various fields approached problem-solving. Chess grandmasters, military strategists, successful entrepreneurs, and top-tier consultants all seemed to share certain cognitive habits that transcended their specific domains. They thought in systems rather than events. They considered second- and third-order consequences rather than just immediate effects. They sought root causes rather than addressing symptoms. They planned backwards from desired outcomes rather than forwards from current circumstances. He spent 3 months deliberately practicing these thinking patterns until they became automatic. Every business challenge was approached through multiple analytical lenses. What are the stakeholder interests involved? What are the potential unintended consequences? What assumptions am I making that might be incorrect? What would this look like from the perspective of our competitors, our customers, our regulators? How does this connect to larger trends and patterns? This systematic approach to analysis dramatically improved the quality of his decisions while also building his reputation as someone who could see around corners and anticipate complications that others missed. Colleagues began seeking his input not just for his solutions, but for his ability to identify problems they hadn't yet recognized. The third component of internal mastery proved the most challenging: developing absolute emotional sovereignty. Marcus had learned to control his external reactions during his initial transformation, but still found his internal emotional state fluctuating based on external circumstances. Success made him feel confident and optimistic. Setbacks triggered anxiety and self-doubt. Criticism from superiors affected his mood for days. Recognition from peers created temporary euphoria followed by a desire for more validation. He recognized that this emotional volatility, while normal, was also a form of strategic vulnerability. Leaders who depend on external circumstances for their emotional stability inevitably make suboptimal decisions when those circumstances become challenging. Moreover, this dependence creates unconscious biases towards seeking approval and avoiding conflict, which limits the range of strategic options available. Marcus began developing what he called emotional independence, the ability to maintain consistent internal equilibrium regardless of external events. This involved several complementary practices. First, he established a daily routine of mental exercises designed to strengthen his capacity for objective self-observation. Each morning, he spent 20 minutes analyzing his current emotional state, identifying any external dependencies or reactive patterns, and consciously choosing his emotional tone for the day based on his strategic objectives rather than his immediate feelings. Second, he began deliberately seeking situations that triggered his reactive patterns, using them as training opportunities to develop emotional discipline. When receiving criticism, he practiced extracting useful information while maintaining internal equanimity. When experiencing success, he learned to appreciate the achievement without becoming psychologically dependent on external recognition. When facing uncertainty, he developed comfort with ambiguity rather than seeking premature closure or false certainty. The most profound aspect of this emotional training involved reframing his relationship with failure and success. Marcus realized that both were largely arbitrary labels that people apply to outcomes based on limited time horizons and subjective criteria. What appeared to be failure in the short term often contained seeds of longer-term success. What felt like success in the moment sometimes created complacency or overconfidence that led to future problems. He began viewing all outcomes as information rather than judgments on his worth or capability. This shift eliminated the emotional charge from both positive and negative results, allowing him to analyze each situation with greater clarity and respond with greater strategic sophistication. The psychological energy that had previously been consumed by emotional reactions became available for creative problem-solving and long-term planning. The fourth dimension of internal mastery involved developing what Marcus termed systematic excellence, the creation of processes and routines that produced superior results regardless of his moment-to-moment motivation or circumstances. He recognized that willpower and inspiration, while valuable, were ultimately unreliable resources that fluctuated based on factors beyond his control. Sustainable high performance required systems that functioned independently of his emotional or physical state. He began documenting and optimizing every aspect of his professional routine. His morning preparation followed a specific sequence designed to maximize mental clarity and emotional stability. His approach to meetings involved standard preparation protocols that ensured he arrived with clear objectives and relevant background information. His project management system captured and tracked all commitments and deadlines, eliminating the cognitive burden of trying to remember everything while ensuring nothing fell through cracks. More importantly, he developed systematic approaches to his most important strategic activities. His relationship building followed documented processes for identifying key stakeholders, understanding their priorities, and creating value for them over time. His skill development involved structured learning programs with measurable milestones and regular assessment points. His strategic planning operated on consistent cycles that integrated daily actions with quarterly objectives and annual goals. These systems created a compound effect that distinguished his performance from colleagues who relied primarily on talent and effort. While others experienced good days and bad days based on their energy levels and external circumstances, Marcus delivered consistent excellence that gradually built an unassailable professional reputation. The psychological dimension of systematic excellence involved what Marcus called identity architecture, the conscious design of his professional persona to align with his strategic objectives. He recognized that most people's professional identities evolved accidentally, shaped by early experiences, random opportunities, and unconscious patterns rather than deliberate intention. This accidental approach often created internal conflicts between who they were and who they needed to become to achieve their goals. Marcus approached identity development with the same systematic rigor he applied to business strategy. He clearly defined the professional persona that would best serve his long-term objectives, identifying the specific traits, capabilities, and behavioral patterns that characterized this ideal version of himself. Then, he created development plans to gradually evolve toward this identity while maintaining authenticity and avoiding the psychological strain of trying to become someone fundamentally incompatible with his core nature. This identity architecture went beyond surface-level changes in behavior or appearance. It involved developing new mental models, emotional patterns, and habitual responses that aligned with his strategic objectives. When facing high-pressure situations, he practiced responding from his desired identity rather than his default personality. When making decisions, he asked himself what the idealized version of himself would choose rather than simply following his immediate impulses. The final aspect of internal mastery centered on what Marcus termed metastrategic thinking, the ability to step back and analyze not just the content of his decisions, but the decision-making processes themselves. He began tracking patterns in his own thinking, identifying cognitive biases and systematic errors that reduced the effectiveness of his analysis. This metacognitive awareness allowed him to continuously refine his thinking processes, creating improvement loops that compounded over time. When he made errors in judgment, he analyzed not just what he had gotten wrong, but why his analytical process had produced incorrect conclusions. When he achieved better than expected results, he examined what thinking patterns had contributed to the success so he could replicate them in future situations. By the end of his second phase of transformation, Marcus had developed levels of self-mastery that bordered on the superhuman. His emotional state remained stable regardless of external circumstances. His decision-making followed systematic processes that consistently produced superior results. His time and attention were deployed with surgical precision toward his highest value activities. His professional persona aligned perfectly with his strategic objectives while remaining authentically connected to his core values and personality. Colleagues began describing him with words like unflappable, laser-focused, and strategic genius, but Marcus understood that these labels described systematic capabilities rather than natural talents. Anyone could develop similar levels of internal mastery through sustained practice and systematic development. Most people simply lacked the discipline or understanding to commit to the process. As he prepared for the third phase of his transformation, Marcus recognized that individual excellence, while necessary, was ultimately limited by the collaborative nature of significant achievements. The next stage would involve extending his strategic sophistication to the realm of organizational dynamics, team leadership, and systematic influence at scale. Part 3, The Orchestrator of Systems. The quarterly board meeting had concluded with unanimous approval for Marcus's proposal to restructure the entire regional operation, an initiative that would affect over 300 employees and redirect millions in resources. As the other executives filed out of the conference room, still processing the implications of what they had just endorsed, Marcus remained seated, reviewing his notes with the calm satisfaction of someone who had orchestrated a complex symphony from initial conception to final applause. 18 months into his transformation, he had progressed beyond individual excellence into something far more sophisticated, the ability to create and direct systems of human behavior that produced outcomes aligned with his strategic vision. This wasn't about manipulation in the crude sense, but about understanding organizational psychology, group dynamics, and the subtle levers that influenced collective decision-making at every level of complexity. The evolution from personal mastery to systemic influence had begun with a crucial realization: individual brilliance, no matter how refined, remains severely constrained by the collaborative nature of meaningful achievement. Every significant accomplishment required the coordinated effort of multiple people, each with their own motivations, priorities, and psychological dynamics. Success at scale demanded the ability to align these diverse elements into coherent patterns that served both individual and collective interests. Marcus had spent 6 months studying organizational behavior from perspectives that most business professionals never encountered. He examined military leadership principles that had proven effective across centuries of high-stakes coordination. He analyzed political campaign strategies that successfully influenced millions of independent decision-makers. He studied cult dynamics to understand how charismatic leaders created absolute loyalty and coordination among followers. He researched successful social movements to identify how ordinary individuals became willing to sacrifice personal comfort for abstract ideals. This research revealed consistent patterns that transcended specific contexts. Effective systemic influence always involved several complementary elements: clear vision that provided direction and meaning, systematic communication that aligned understanding across diverse perspectives, incentive structures that made desired behaviors self-reinforcing, and feedback mechanisms that allowed continuous adjustment based on changing circumstances. Most importantly, he learned that sustainable influence required creating systems where people chose to behave in desired ways because those behaviors served their authentic interests, rather than trying to force compliance through external pressure or manipulation. This approach produced far more reliable results while avoiding the psychological resistance and eventual rebellion that characterized coercive leadership. The first dimension of systemic influence involved what Marcus termed narrative architecture, the creation of compelling stories that gave meaning and direction to collective effort. He recognized that human beings are fundamentally story-driven creatures who interpret their experiences through narrative frameworks that provide coherence and purpose to otherwise random events. Most organizational leaders, he observed, focused on describing what needed to be done without adequately explaining why it mattered or how it connected to larger purposes that people actually cared about. This approach might generate compliance, but it rarely produced the enthusiasm and creative engagement necessary for exceptional results. People performed adequately when they understood their tasks, but they performed extraordinarily when they understood their roles in meaningful narratives. Marcus began crafting stories that positioned his initiatives within larger contexts that naturally appealed to his colleagues' deepest motivations. His restructuring proposal wasn't presented as a cost-cutting measure or efficiency improvement, but as an opportunity to create the industry's most innovative and responsive organization, one that would become a model for other companies while providing unprecedented career advancement opportunities for current employees. This narrative framework transformed potential resistance into enthusiasm. Instead of viewing the changes as threats to their security or status, employees began seeing them as investments in their professional futures. Department heads who might have protected their territories began collaborating to ensure the success of an initiative they now understood would enhance their own long-term prospects. The second element of systemic influence centered on what Marcus called incentive engineering, the systematic design of reward and recognition structures that made desired behaviors self-reinforcing rather than requiring constant oversight or external motivation. He studied game design principles to understand how successful systems created intrinsic motivation through achievement, progress tracking, and social recognition. Traditional corporate incentive systems, he realized, often created unintended consequences that undermined their stated objectives. Sales compensation that rewarded individual performance over team collaboration. Performance reviews that encouraged short-term thinking at the expense of long-term value creation. Recognition programs that felt arbitrary or political rather than merit-based. Budget processes that penalized efficiency and rewarded spending. Marcus began proposing modifications to these systems that aligned individual rewards with collective success while maintaining clear accountability for individual contribution. He suggested team-based metrics that required collaboration to achieve. He recommended recognition programs that celebrated problem-solving and innovation rather than just results. He advocated for development opportunities that rewarded people for building capabilities that served both their personal growth and organizational needs. These changes created cascading effects throughout the organization. People began naturally collaborating because collaboration served their individual interests. They started thinking longer term because long-term thinking was explicitly rewarded. They became more innovative because innovation was systematically recognized and supported. The culture evolved not through speeches or mission statements, but through systematic changes in the experiences that shaped daily behavior. The third aspect of systemic influence involved developing what Marcus termed distributed leadership, the ability to create other leaders who could extend his influence far beyond his direct span of control. He recognized that individual leadership, no matter how skilled, remained limited by time and attention constraints. Sustainable systemic influence required developing capabilities in others that aligned with his strategic vision while serving their authentic development needs. This wasn't about creating followers or disciples, but about identifying individuals with leadership potential and providing them with frameworks, resources, and opportunities that enhanced their effectiveness while ensuring their success contributed to larger strategic objectives. Marcus began systematically mentoring high-potential colleagues, not through formal programs or obvious sponsorship, but through carefully structured interactions that provided valuable insights and opened strategic opportunities. He learned to identify each person's unique strengths and development needs, then create situations where they could build capabilities while contributing to initiatives he considered important. A colleague with strong analytical skills but limited presentation experience was given opportunities to lead client meetings with appropriate preparation and support. Someone with excellent technical knowledge but underdeveloped strategic thinking was included in planning sessions where they could observe and gradually participate in higher-level decision-making. This approach created a network of increasingly capable leaders who naturally collaborated with Marcus because he had contributed to their professional success. They didn't follow him out of obligation or hierarchy, but out of recognition that their interests aligned with his and that his strategic thinking enhanced their own effectiveness. Over time, this network became a powerful force for implementing initiatives and influencing organizational direction. The fourth dimension of systemic influence focused on what Marcus called information architecture, the strategic management of knowledge flow throughout the organization to ensure that decision-makers at every level had access to the insights necessary for sound judgment while maintaining appropriate confidentiality and competitive advantage. Most organizations, he observed, suffered from systematic information dysfunction. Critical insights remained trapped within departmental silos. Decision-makers lacked context necessary for understanding the full implications of their choices. Strategic initiatives failed because implementation teams didn't understand the underlying logic or importance of specific requirements. Rumors and speculation filled information voids, creating confusion and undermining trust. Marcus began creating systematic communication processes that addressed these problems without overwhelming people with irrelevant detail or compromising sensitive information. He established regular forums where different departments could share insights relevant to others' work. He developed briefing formats that provided context and rationale for major initiatives without revealing competitively sensitive details. He created feedback loops that allowed implementation teams to communicate challenges and suggestions back to strategic decision-makers. Most importantly, he positioned himself as a trusted source of reliable information by consistently providing accurate, relevant, and timely insights to anyone who needed them. This reputation for information quality made people seek his perspective on important decisions, giving him influence over outcomes while providing value to those who consulted him. The fifth element of systemic influence involved what Marcus termed culture engineering, the systematic cultivation of organizational norms, values, and behavioral patterns that supported his strategic objectives while creating genuine value for all participants. He understood that culture was not something that could be decreed or mandated, but rather emerged from the accumulated experience of how people were treated, what behaviors were rewarded, and what standards were consistently maintained. Marcus began systematically modeling the behavioral patterns he wanted to see throughout the organization. His meetings started and ended on time, demonstrating respect for participants' time and attention. His communications were clear, concise, and action-oriented, establishing standards for effective information exchange. His decision-making was transparent in its logic while appropriately confidential in its details, showing how to balance openness with discretion. More importantly, he consistently recognized and supported others who demonstrated these same behavioral patterns, creating positive reinforcement for the cultural norms he wanted to establish. When colleagues prepared thoroughly for meetings, he acknowledged their professionalism. When team members communicated clearly and concisely, he ensured their contributions received appropriate attention. When individuals made decisions based on sound analysis rather than politics or emotion, he provided public recognition for their judgment. This systematic reinforcement gradually shifted organizational norms in directions that served both effectiveness and his strategic objectives. Meetings became more productive because people prepared adequately and stayed focused on objectives. Communication became more effective because people took responsibility for clarity and relevance. Decision-making improved because analytical rigor was consistently valued over political considerations. The sixth aspect of systemic influence centered on what Marcus called strategic patience, the ability to implement long-term initiatives through sequences of smaller actions that built momentum over time rather than requiring dramatic gestures or sudden transformations. He understood that sustainable organizational change happened gradually, through consistent application of pressure in strategic directions rather than through revolutionary upheavals that triggered defensive reactions. Marcus learned to think in multiple time horizons simultaneously, identifying immediate actions that served short-term objectives while contributing to longer-term strategic evolution. His restructuring proposal, for example, was introduced through a series of smaller pilot programs that demonstrated value and built support before being presented as a comprehensive initiative. His leadership development activities created gradually expanding networks of capable allies before becoming visible as systematic influence campaigns. This approach avoided the resistance that typically accompanied obvious attempts to accumulate power or implement major changes. By the time people recognized the scope of his influence, they had already experienced its benefits and become invested in its success. Opposition became less likely because potential resistors had participated in creating the outcomes they might otherwise have opposed. The final dimension of systemic influence involved developing what Marcus termed adaptive leadership, the ability to continuously refine his approaches based on changing circumstances, new information, and evolving organizational dynamics. He recognized that rigid adherence to specific strategies, no matter how well conceived, eventually became ineffective as conditions changed and other people adapted to his methods. Marcus established systematic processes for monitoring the effectiveness of his influence attempts, tracking both intended and unintended consequences of his initiatives. He created feedback loops that provided early warning when approaches weren't producing expected results or were creating unexpected problems. He developed relationships with people who would provide honest assessment of his impact, even when that assessment might be uncomfortable. Most importantly, he maintained psychological flexibility that allowed him to modify or abandon approaches that weren't working without experiencing this as personal failure or loss of face. His identity became attached to achieving strategic objectives rather than to specific methods, allowing him to experiment with new approaches and learn from unexpected outcomes. By the conclusion of his transformation journey, Marcus had evolved far beyond his original aspirations. He had become someone capable of orchestrating complex organizational systems while maintaining genuine respect for the individuals within those systems. His influence operated through systematic enhancement of others' capabilities rather than through dominance or manipulation. His success created success for others, making his leadership both sustainable and ethically defensible. The quarterly board meeting that approved his restructuring proposal represented not just a professional victory, but validation of a comprehensive approach to human interaction that integrated individual excellence, systematic thinking, and ethical consideration of others' interests. As he sat in the empty conference room, reviewing the commitment documents that would reshape hundreds of careers and redirect millions in resources, Marcus understood that true power lay not in the ability to impose his will on others, but in the capacity to create systems where everyone's authentic interests aligned with outcomes he considered strategically important. The transformation from middle manager to strategic orchestrator had required 18 months of systematic development across multiple dimensions of capability. But Marcus recognized that this achievement represented not an end point, but a foundation for even more sophisticated levels of influence and impact. The principles he had mastered, strategic thinking, emotional discipline, systematic excellence, and ethical influence, would continue to evolve and compound throughout his career, creating possibilities he could not yet envision but was now equipped to recognize and pursue when they emerged. In a world where most people remained reactive, emotionally driven, and focused on short-term gratification, the individual who mastered these Machiavellian principles, properly understood as strategic sophistication rather than crude manipulation, possessed advantages that bordered on the supernatural. Not because they operated outside ethical boundaries, but because they had learned to work within human nature rather than against it, creating outcomes that served both their interests and the authentic needs of those around them. The empty conference room, with its lingering echoes of unanimous approval and enthusiastic commitment, stood as testament to what became possible when strategic thinking, systematic development, and ethical consideration converged in a single individual who understood that true influence required not the domination of others, but the orchestration of systems where everyone could succeed through the pursuit of aligned objectives.